Greco-Persian Wars. The wars would be fought between 499 and 449 BC between the Greek city-states and the Achaemenid Empire. It would end in Greek victory. It would also see the likes of Miltiades, Pericles, Leonidas I, Themistocles, Xerxes, Artemisia, and Darius the Great. It would end in the change of territory, with several states gaining their independence and being liberated. But what would start the conflicts, and what events would cause two of the world's behemoths to come to such a clash? In 547 BC, Cyrus the Great had overcome Ionia, a region for which Miletus would be the most important city. Cyrus the Great was the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and in his reign he would go on to achieve several feats, including winning against the Median Empire. The empire he created would also continue to have presence in West and Central Asia. Amongst other empires that would fall to Cyrus would be the Lydian Empire. He would die in 530 BC. His son Cambyses II would follow him, but his rule would be short. By the time that the events of the Greco-Persian Wars would occur, Darius II was ruler in the Achaemenid Empire. In Ionia, tyrants would be placed in charge on behalf of the Persian Empire, and these would create discontent within the population. One of these tyrants would play a role in the start of the Ionian rebellion that would lead to the beginning of the Greco-Persian Wars. The story goes like this. Aristagoras was the tyrant of Miletus. And at one point in time, with the backing of the Persians, he would move to invade the island of Naxos. But the attempt would be fated to fail, in part, due to conflict that occurred between Aristagoras and a Persian admiral. Knowing that the end of his reign was near, Aristagoras would move to incite revolution against the Persians. An act that history would come to know him for. The Ionian Revolt had been born. Athens and Eretria would help the Ionians in this. In 498 BC, Sardis, a Persian regional capital, would be placed to siege by a Greek force, and eventually set aflame, accidentally or on purpose, in an act known as the Burning of Sardis. An act that would come to incite the Persian king Darius the Great. Fighting would therefore continue. Important battles like the Battle of Lade would occur. This one in particular occurred in 494 BC and would in large parts come to determine the fate of the Ionian Revolt. The Ionian alliance would lose a lot more ships than the Persian Empire, and after the events of the Battle of Lade, the rebellion would be picked apart by the Persians. Persia would regain its ascendancy and control in the region. However, something important had become more apparent to Darius. The Greek world was a threat to the Persian Empire. He would therefore move to invade Greece. In 492 BC, the first Persian invasion would begin. Going back to the city-states of Athens and Eretria, this move was also a chance to punish the Athenians and Eretrians for their support for the Ionian Revolt. Mardonius would lead the campaign, and through it several changes would come about. One of the major changes would see Macedon, previously a vassal to Persia, change into a client kingdom. Another change would involve Thrace, a region which had contributed to Persian armies previously in history. Now they would be subjugated again by the Persians. All of Greece would be sent ambassadors from Darius who demanded surrender from them. Most of the states succeeded except Athens and Sparta. War was coming. Another force, this time under Datis and Artaphernes, would be sent in 490 BC. And they would continue on to Naxos, an island that went on to be captured and burned. Datis was a noble and admiral. When the revolt in Ionia had occurred, Datis had been a commander in the Persian army, and he would play a part in some of the conflicts. He and Artaphernes would therefore be charged with this part of the campaign. Artaphernes was the younger of the pair, a nephew to Darius the Great. Their plan would be to use the eastern coast of Greece as an important region for part of their conflict. The Cycladic islands would be added to the Persian Empire during this period, and Eretria would be besieged and would fall. After this, the force would arrive in Marathon. The setting for an upset which would define history for much of the following period, and put a pause on their plans. The Battle of Marathon. In this section, we will look at interesting aspects of the battle, including who were the individuals involved, what were the strategies used, and what events would occur. We will also try to answer why the Battle of Marathon would hold so much significance for the future of the Greek and Achaemenid worlds. A battle between the Persian forces and the Greek forces would occur, the Athenians aided by Plataea. The Battle of Marathon would see the Athenian forces claim a victory that with the course of events seemed unlikely, but one that would dramatically change the course of events going forward. With a lot of factors seemingly out of their favor from a numerical standpoint, the Athenians would be outnumbered probably 3-1. The force from Persia after the events in Eretria would make its way in an attempt to reach Attica. Their ships would find themselves plodding in a bay close to Marathon, a town in the region, where they would see some of their paths from the plains blocked by the Athenians. Thus the scene for the epic battle that would pit Miltiades at the helm against the Persians. A battle that was to change the tone of the wars, and possibly give a glimmer of hope. Of note, there was also another event that was occurring in a different place, but one that would have a bearing on the events that would follow. The Spartans would be observing a religious festival, so that when a messenger was dispatched to them seeking aid for the Athenians, they would not be able to send their aid to them, but they would be able to receive support from Plataea, a city-state found in Boeotia. Perhaps a great testament to the role of tactics on the battlefield, and a testament to the military and tactical ability of the Athenians, the battle would be set before it started. To their advantage was the geography of the terrain. Playing to their advantage and preventing the Persians from mounting their full strength in one continuous force against the Athenians. The Athenians would attack with a fervor and purpose that outnumbered would be noted as near madness by the Persians who were facing them. The Athenians would eventually win the flanks, and work into the center, overwhelming the Persian forces as they went, devastating the greater force until the Persians would be forced into a retreat. One that was complicated by its own issues. For one, the lack of knowledge of the terrain itself would act as a vice, compromising Persian numbers that had already been whittled by the challenge of warfare. The thick mist of confusion would see some Persians waddle into the swamps where some would drown. Pursuit would drive the beaten and humiliated Persians back to their ships, but they would still continue to lose men as they went. The numbers that the Persians lost would outnumber those the Athenians had lost by some way. An interesting question arises from the ashes of the battlefield: what had happened and how had it transpired? The answer isn't as clear-cut as one would suppose, and a lot of factors probably contributed to the Athenian victory, from the men and their courage, to the greater knowledge of the terrain, to even issues of strategy. Intentional or unintentional, the Athenians had made their front line thin, to meet the Persian army on the battlefield. This would allow the Athenians to outflank the Persians and overwhelm them. Thus would end the Battle of Marathon. But it wasn't the end of the Persians' attempts. An attack on Athens would be in their plans, and they would make a play for the city. But the Athenians would be aware and cognizant of this threat to the city and would therefore be prepared for it. The city would find itself sufficiently defended, repelling a Persian attack, and forcing them into a journey back to Asia. The Battle of Marathon within the context of the wars would be a significant point, for what would happen after and the message that the outcome sent. The great Persian army that had established a reputation for its might could be overcome. Victory was possible, victory was within reach, there were weaknesses that could be used. But Darius wasn't one to stay and lick his wounds for long, and plans were already in the making for another attempt at the invasions. His vow on revenge had to be seen through, but it wasn't to be in his lifetime. He would die before seeing his aspirations fulfilled, and the throne would be passed on to his son, Xerxes I. maybe the son would be able to succeed and carry forward what the father had tried to. He would come to power in 486 BC, son of Darius and Artosa. Artosa was daughter to Cyrus the Great. Darius having gained the throne from Bardia or someone impersonating Bardia, his legacy would include the changes that he had made in the administration of Persia, and in the monetary system. Other improvements would also be seen through his reign: buildings he would raise, roads he would build, and innovations he would bring about. The empire he would rule stretched extensive lengths, but it would be susceptible to several revolts, some of them that weakened them, reaching into the Balkans and all the way to the Indus Valley. Other events that would occur would be an invasion of the Indus Valley, a Babylonian revolt, a conflict with the Scythians, and other significant events. After Darius' death, Xerxes would take over, attending to Egyptian revolts, and handling them, before he continued where his father had started with the invasion of Greece. Plans had to be put in action, lessons learned from the first attempt had to be applied, and preparations for the wars had to be made. The Persian army would be drawn from several nations and regions. On the Greek side, the intervening time would be marked by several changes, including the death of Miltiades, who had played a significant role in the Battle of Marathon. But the Greeks wouldn't become completely unaware of the threat that the Persian nation still posed, and Themistocles would see to it that their naval abilities would be increased. Though not without political resistance from several different quarters, and not without using some of his political acumen. Socio-political factors would also come into play into the decision to continue the increment of their naval abilities and resources. Themistocles had a power base that could be said to have derived itself from the lower-class Athenians. He had been involved in the Battle of Marathon, and the second phase of the invasions would also see him involved, this time leading the Greeks at the battles of Artemisium and Salamis. Some of his policies would far outlast him, and history would remember him, and the role he played with the Greeks. Which is not to say that his life wouldn't be riddled with lows and highs, including having to live in exile after the Greco-Persian Wars. Moving back to the wars, some of the Greek states would come together and meet in Corinth. A few things would change going forward. A confederation would emerge, and they would be able to bring together resources, and make decisions collectively, a feat that was made remarkable by the state of affairs between some of the Greek states, which had had a history of conflict between each other, rivalries and clashes. In 491, when Darius had dispatched emissaries, seeking tokens of submission to his authority from the Greek states, Athens and Sparta would be in the minority as they refused. Sparta would throw the emissaries down a well, Athens would put the individuals to trial. About 10 years later, Xerxes had decided to use Hellespont. His army would be able to make progress. One event that would gain some repute even far into the future would be the event that would occur at Thermopylae. Thermopylae was a narrow pass, renowned in part for its sulfur springs, and rumored to contain the entrance to Hades. For one to be able to go from north to south, one had to use the passes. Having failed to defend and repel the Persian forces' advances at the Vale of Tempe as they originally planned, the Greeks would move to use the geography of Thermopylae to their advantage. And that is exactly what they did. Particularly Themistocles. Here is how the renowned battle that would see the greats like Leonidas of Sparta, and Leontiades of Thebes, would occur, and how around 7,000 would be able to face a force that was nearly 20 times larger. Themistocles, the man who had been able to convince other Athenians to build a navy, would convince the Greeks to take part in an attempt to stop the Persian advance. This would stall the Persians' further advance on the land, whilst a second part would block the Persians at sea at the Straits of Artemisium. The 7,000 Greeks would be led by the Spartan king Leonidas I. The Spartans would unfortunately be observing the festival of Carnia, added to which were the Olympic Games and the Olympic truce. Spartan law made military actions during the festival of Carnia unacceptable and unthinkable. But an advance force of 300 would be sent. The Spartans were a force renowned and known for their abilities on the battlefield. It was how it ended up being that Leonidas and his hoplites would find themselves on the way to Thermopylae with soldiers that were able to join them from different cities. Camp was made at the middle gate, and a force of 1,000 were sent to guard a track in the mountains that was a vulnerability to the plan of the Greeks. Through it, their flank could be overcome and approached. The odds that the Greeks were facing at this point were immense. The numerical supremacy of the Persians was vast and defeat seemed all but certain, but the story that follows represents a David versus Goliath level of victory against an enemy that had greater resources at its disposal. Wave after wave of Persian forces would be sent against the Greek phalanx. Men arranged next to each other, bravely, sternly, with overlapping shields with interspaced spears stretching out from the wall. Wave after wave was sent, wave after wave would fall from the Persians, but few from the Greeks' side would fall. The Immortals would also be sent, but they too would find the challenge of the well-organized, well-drilled, well-planned phalanx too difficult to overcome. Day 2 of the conflict would come, and little would change in the trajectory that the battle was going for the Persians. Enter Ephialtes, a local who would approach the Persians with knowledge of a path. The Persians, now armed with an opportunity to unravel the Greeks and their insurmountable defense, would take it, and by the third day, they would use the path. The Persians would be able to bypass the Phocians that had been placed by Leonidas to guard the path, and Leonidas, gaining knowledge of this development, would call for a council of war. Some argued for retreat, but Leonidas had decided to stay, others would stay with him. On the battlefield, he would order some forces to retreat. He and the Spartans that had come with him, along with others including some Thespians, Thebans and Helots, would guard the retreat of a greater force. An ultimate demonstration of sacrifice, bravery and dedication. In the conflicts, Xerxes would lose 2 of his brothers, Abracomes and Hyperanthes. Whilst the pass was being held at Thermopylae by King Leonidas and the men that were with him, a second conflict, just as central and essential to the Greco-Persian wars, was occurring, this one at sea. It would occur near Evia. The naval contingent that Xerxes had built was massive. But a storm would reduce the numbers of the ships the Persians had been able to amass, doing massive damage to the force that had been prepared for the invasion. The first loss to the Persian forces would happen off the coast of Magnesia. But the calamities at sea would not stop. A second group would be caught as they sailed around the coast of Evia. When the Allies found out about the fate of the ground forces at Thermopylae, they withdrew to Salamis. This occurred after days of conflict that would see losses on both sides. With the Allies retreating, Phocis, Boeotia and Attica would fall to the Persians, who would be able to enter into the walls of Athens. For their retreat the Allies had chosen the island of Salamis. Some Athenians would have been evacuated from Athens to Salamis. The few that remained would offer resistance to the Persians. They would ultimately lose. Now an interesting part of the wars. With the 2 armies positioned as they were. For Xerxes, his position and ability to force the Allies into surrendering could be reinforced significantly if he was able to defeat the Allies' naval force. For the Allies, staying in the battle as long as possible and deferring their defeat would stop the Persians from achieving their goal. Now looking at the events of the Battle of Salamis, which would be fought in September of 480 BC. Again in the battle, geography and intelligence would play a substantial role in gifting a smaller force success. A massive event in the history of the Greco-Persian wars, and in the history of that time. The battle would end with the Persians having to withdraw from Attica. Themistocles would use the information that he had been able to glean from his involvement at Artemisium to reach an accurate conclusion of a weakness in the Persian navy. Close-quarter battle for the Persian navy was their weakness, and the plan that would be contrived by Themistocles would use this apparent weakness to the hilt. At a point in the course of events Xerxes would call a war meeting, and in it certain individuals would warn him about the risks and disadvantages of attacking the Allies' position. Advice that he would ignore, to his undoing. Added to the information that was privy to Xerxes would be information that Themistocles would purposely add, or allow to filter due to a level of cunning and foresight. Some of it might have included stories of growing disunity between the Allies and their next move, and another could have been the location of the forces. Subterfuge and foresight would be Themistocles' weapon of choice, and the information that he was able to feed Xerxes would ultimately work its way into achieving his goals. Xerxes would dispatch his fleet. The numbers on the Persian side would be overwhelming. And tactically their position was stronger. All they had to do was probably wait to play their hand, but many factors would push them into acting as they did, including a desire to conclude the invasion, and the knowledge that staying there with such a force as large as his was not something they could sustain for an extremely protracted period. Some of the events and facts of the actual day of battle cannot be claimed with absolute certainty. At some point it seems the Persians would turn back and retreat. After the battle, a council of war would be held. Xerxes, perceiving the possibility that his army might find itself marooned in Europe if the Greeks had chosen to target Hellespont. The bulk of the army was withdrawn, leaving Mardonius with some of the troops to complete the effort at invasion. When they withdrew from Athens, the Athenians would be able to retake it, but at some point in the future they would lose it once again to the Persians. But the Battle of Salamis had already gone some way into creating doubt in the Persians, and weakening their position. The Battle of Salamis would be remembered as an important point in the course of the wars, and an important part of history. After the battle, a stalemate would result, with neither side wanting to attack the other for a while. Mardonius would send an offer to the Athenians, which was rejected, the Athenians preferring freedom. With the offer refused, the Persians made their move, reoccupying Athens, and again sending an offer. The Athenians would look for assistance from Sparta, and Sparta would deploy a force. The episode that follows would further cement the fate of the Persians, and further strengthen the position that the Allies would now have. The Battle of Mycale and the Battle of Plataea 479 BC. The Greek army would make an aggressive move to march out, causing the Persian army's retreat. Fortified camp would be made by the Persians on the bank of the Asopus River. But the Greeks would decide against further progress. The position they held was higher and to their advantage. The Persians would attempt several times to change this, and get the Greeks to cede this advantage. The Greeks would attempt to retreat to another location when their supply was interrupted, and their access to water was hampered. The Allies' retreat would be filled with chaos and mistakes, and the Persians would follow them as they retreated. But some forces from the Allies would stand ground, and the battle would prove successful for the Greek allies. Mardonius would pass away in the battle. A few Persians would flee, then more and more joined until it was a general retreat. Storming the Persian camp would be a step taken by the Greek side. Being able to break through eventually, a lot of the Persians contained within would perish. Few would be left to live. The victory here at Plataea would be massive. The Battle of Mycale would see the Allies emerge triumphant as well. With the Persian ships in poor state, the Persians initially chose to remain out of the fray, choosing to put their ships to land, and protect them. But the Allies would attack, and win. Thus the Persian ships would be set to the flame. An important step towards further weakening the position of the Persians. The Persians would retreat, losing many men along the way. Some would fall to the enemies, some to sheer exhaustion. And furthermore to privation and hunger. A new era was born which would see a new tide set in, and the fate of the Greek world take a new direction. Thank you for listening to this podcast.